Welcome to North Point. We are so happy to see you today. Choosing to get up to spend the Lord's Day the Lord's way. Heaven is obviously on your mind, and we're thankful for that. All we want to do is go to heaven. That's our desire. And we want to take as many people with us as possible. Do you know how they say opposites attract? Well, that's certainly true of Jill and me. We do have a lot in common, but in many areas we are totally different. For instance, I tend to take chances. Jill likes to play it safe. I like visiting big cities. Jill would rather be in a cabin in the woods. And I think being President of the United States would be a really cool job. Jill thinks it would be absolutely awful. Just out of curiosity, how many are with me on that? You think being president would be cool? I think so. He's the commander-in-chief, controlling the most powerful military in the history of the world. He can grant clemency and pardons. He can sign executive orders and veto legislation. He rides around in a tank disguised as a limo. And his private airplane is so high-tech that many of its features are classified. He's protected by the Secret Service and is always near the nuclear football. That sounds pretty cool. But if you ask Jill, the thought of being president or the thought of being the first lady would be a nightmare. But as important and powerful as the president is, he too is just a man, right? He may have a lot of influence, he may have a lot of power, but at the end of the day, he has the same human weaknesses and frailties that the rest of us have. I mean, who can forget this scene from October 2020? Marine One to take President Trump to Walter Reed. Trump was a big guy, an energetic president, had a lot of influence, a lot of power, and yet he fell prey to coronavirus. A stark reminder that even powerful people are susceptible to serious illness and disease. Well, the guy we're going to talk about today could certainly relate to that. He was not President of the United States, but he was very powerful in his own right. His name is Naaman, and his story is in 2 Kings 5. In 2 Kings 5, verse 1, we're introduced to him. We read, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now notice what the Bible says about him. These are some pretty impressive credentials. He was a commander of the army, a great man, in high favor. By him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor. Wouldn't you agree that's quite a resume? Naaman was a high-ranking military official with a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. In fact, did you know Jewish tradition says that Naaman was the archer who killed King Ahab? I don't know if it's true, but Jewish tradition thinks so. He had risen through the ranks in Syria, and he had become a very important person. Some commentators today liken him to a 5-star general, or even to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But there was one chink in his armor. He was a leper. Leprosy was a dreaded disease. It started off with just small red spots on the skin, but before long those red spots started to spread and then they turned white. They became flaky and the skin would literally just fall off. Not only would the skin fall off, but your hair, your toenails, and your fingernails would fall off. Your gums would become deformed and your teeth would start to fall out. Worst of all, there was no cure for leprosy. It was terminal. So here we're introduced to this great warrior, this valiant Syrian commander. But he was a leper. And that leads us into our story today. Picking up in verse 2, we read, "Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, 'Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy.' So Naaman went in and told his Lord, 'Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel.' And the king of Syria said, 'Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel.'" The Syrians were enemies of Israel. They were a constant nemesis. And on occasion, the Syrians would make raids into the land of Israel, carrying off whatever was of value, whether that be possessions or people. On one raid, they had carried off a little girl. Think about that. She had been abducted. She had been kidnapped. She had been carried off from her home to a foreign land where she's made a servant. I wonder what happened to her parents. Have you ever thought about that? Were her parents taken captive? Were her parents killed during the raid? We don't know. But now she's serving Mrs. Naaman. And one day she goes up to Mrs. Naaman and says, "You know, mistress, there is a prophet back home who I know could heal Naaman. Oh, how I wish he could go and see him." Isn't that impressive? This little girl could easily harbor a lot of resentment and revenge. She could very easily justify being happy with Naaman's condition. He deserves it. But instead she felt compassion. So much so that she goes to Mrs. Naaman and says, "Look, there is a prophet who can heal him. I know he can if Naaman could only go and see him." Well, desperate times call for desperate measures. Mrs. Naaman tells Naaman, Naaman tells the king of Syria, and the king of Syria says, "Look, I'll send you to him. I'll even write a letter of endorsement. I will write a letter to their king telling them that I've sent you for healing." Verse 5b beginning. "So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, 'When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy.' And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, 'Am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he's seeking a quarrel with me.'" Naaman not only comes to the king of Israel with a letter of endorsement from his king, but he brings lavish gifts. Did you notice he brought 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold? I'm told that in today's currency, that would be about $80,000. So Naaman comes with $80,000 and 10 changes of expensive clothing. You might call it a bribe. You might call it a purchase. Whatever you want to call it. They thought, we'll send the letter, we'll bring some lavish gifts, and hopefully you'll find favor in their sight. The letter was very direct. "I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." Now put yourself in the king of Israel's position. Here is this mighty Syrian commander. He hands you a letter, and the letter says, "He's sick with leprosy. I'm expecting you to cure him." What? And apparently the king never thought about Elisha and the miracles he could perform. All he thought is, he wants war. This is a pretext for war. He's setting me up. I mean, after all, who does he think I am? Does he think I'm God? Am I omnipotent? Do I have the power to cure leprosy? He tore his clothes and was utterly distraught. Verse 8. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots, and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. Somehow Elisha got word of what was going on. He was told that Naaman, this powerful Syrian commander, had come, that he was seeking to be healed, and that the king of Israel was utterly distraught. Didn't know what to do. Elisha sends word saying, Don't worry about this. Send him to me. Send him to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. Did the king have a better option? No. And so sure enough, he tells Naaman, Go see the prophet Elisha. Did you notice it says Naaman came with his horses and chariots? You have to understand that Samaria was a small, insignificant area. Naaman is coming with his entourage. He's coming with his horses and chariots. I got to thinking about that, and I would liken it to a presidential motorcade traveling through Elk Creek. Everybody's going to notice, right? And so here he comes, standing at the house of Elisha. But Elisha didn't even come out to greet him. Elisha sends out a messenger saying, Go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be healed. What? Naaman was a man of prestige, a man of privilege. He has come to your doorstep and you don't even come out to greet him? You just send out a messenger? And if he were offended by Elisha's actions, he was even more offended by Elisha's instructions. If you want to be healed, go dip in the dirty Jordan 7 times. The Jordan River was 20 miles away. It was a very muddy river. It paled in comparison to the beauty of the rivers back home. And so when Naaman hears this, he is offended. He is outraged. Doesn't he know who I am? Verse 11. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Naaman was angry. That's probably an understatement. He could not believe what he's seeing. I've traveled all this distance. I've got authority from my king. I've brought expensive gifts. And this is all I get? This is the treatment I receive? I don't even get to meet the prophet. He sends out a messenger, tells me to go and dip in some dirty river. Behold, I thought he would come out to me, that he'd call upon the name of his God, waving his hands over my body and heal me. That's what he anticipated. That's what he expected. You see, in Naaman's mind, this scene had already played out. But reality did not match what he thought. That's an important lesson for us. Did you notice those three words? Very, very important words. Behold, I thought. When it comes to God, that'll get you in trouble. The Bible says that His thoughts are not our thoughts. They're greater than our thoughts. But too often, people put their trust in their own thinking. Behold, I thought. Behold, Eve thought it was okay to eat the forbidden tree. Cain thought it was okay to offer a vegetable sacrifice. Nadab and Abihu thought that fire was fire. 10 of the 12 spies thought that Canaan was not conquerable. The young prophet thought he could eat with the old prophet. The Jews thought it was better to release Barabbas and kill Jesus. Do you see my point? We need to check our thinking, our thoughts, our preconceived ideas at the door. Let God be true. But Naaman wasn't thinking like that. He already knew how this would play out. He already knew how this would go down. And when it didn't, he saw red. The text says he turned and went away in a rage. Finally, verses 13 and 14. But his servants came near and said to him, My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, Wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. You know, I kind of picture Naaman getting back on his chariot and heading home. Probably red-faced, grinding his teeth, clenching his fists. This guy was fit to be tied. All the time, all the effort. This is such a humiliation. Doesn't he know who I am? If you're one of his servants, probably not a good time to talk to Naaman, right? It'd be real easy to sit back and say, I'm not going to say a word to this guy. But to their credit, his servants garnered up the courage to approach him. Mr. Naaman, sir, what do you want? I know you're upset. Well, we get that. But he did say you could be healed, right? I mean, if you think about it, didn't he say that you could wash and be clean? I guess he did. This is a great word. He didn't say you're hopeless. He didn't say I won't do it. He actually did say to you, wash and be clean, right? Naaman had to swallow his pride and say, yeah, I guess so. He turned the chariot around, went to the dirty Jordan River, and dipped 7 times. I picture Naaman getting to the water's edge. He probably turned back to look at all the horses and chariots with all the men standing there. And I wonder what he was thinking. What am I doing? And then he steps into the water. And he gets out into the water waist high or better. He probably turns back a second time. Here goes nothing. 1. He's still a leper. 2. Still a leper. 3. 4. 5. What was he thinking after that 6th time? It's all or nothing. And miraculously, his skin was restored. He was healed of his leprosy. I love the language. His flesh became like that of a little child. Have you ever noticed how smooth a baby's skin feels? That was Naaman. And let me tell you something. This didn't just transform his flesh. This transformed his soul. This is a conversion story. If we were to continue reading, he travels back to the prophet. He thanks the prophet over and over and goes home a believer in Yahweh, a believer in the God of Israel. Did you know Jesus, in Luke 4, verse 27, said there were many sick lepers at that time, and only Naaman was healed? That's grace. God's grace not upon a Jew, but upon a Gentile. Jesus endorses this story as true. When he came up out of the water that seventh time, he was cleansed. This is a foreshadowing of baptism. The Old Testament does a lot of foreshadowing. There are a lot of types in the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the New Testament. This is a foreshadowing of baptism. Follow along with me. Naaman suffered from a deadly disease physically, right? He was a leper. He needed to be cleansed. He was told to dip in water, and when he did, he rose up cleansed. That's true of the conversion story of Christians. We suffered from a deadly disease spiritually. We needed to be cleansed. We were told to dip in water, and when we did, we rose up cleansed. Do you see the parallel? This is a type-anti-type situation. Naaman's healing is a foreshadowing of our healing. Listen, if you're here today and you've never been immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, you're a leper. I'm not saying that to hurt you, I'm saying that to help you. You're a leper. And you can't see the marks of leprosy on your skin, but they're on your soul, believe me. You're doomed to die. And yet, if you'll just humble yourself like Naaman did, do you think he had to swallow some pride? Sure he did. Do you think it was kind of embarrassing walking down into that dirty Jordan with all his men watching? Sure it was. We try to make it as easy as possible, but there's a little embarrassment. But it's the best decision you could ever make. It will transform your life and save your soul. And when I talk about Naaman, I love to make the point that here's a case where grace was appropriated conditionally. In other words, God's grace is in play, but it was dependent upon an obedient faith, right? Naaman was cleansed of leprosy by grace. Would any doubt or deny that? He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. It was God's unmerited favor. Naaman was healed of leprosy by grace. When? When he dipped in water. We see this throughout the Bible. Noah was saved from the flood by grace. When? When he built an ark. The Israelites were healed of snake bite by grace. When? When they looked on the bronze serpent. The Israelites conquered Jericho by grace. When? When they marched around the walls. The 10 lepers were cleansed of leprosy by grace. When? When they went to show themselves to the priest. And sinners on the day of Pentecost were cleansed of their sins by grace. When? When they dipped in water. When they were baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Do you see that? People today make a huge mistake. They try to pit grace and obedience against each other, as if it's an either-or scenario. It's not either-or, it's and both. Our works of obedience do not disqualify grace. That's how grace is received. And this is true from Genesis to Revelation. Well, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from the story of Naaman. We could talk about the fact you can't buy God's grace. God's grace is for the humble. We could talk about the danger of preconceived ideas and think-sos. We could talk about the danger of pride. Right? There are a lot of lessons we can learn. But I want to focus on a lesson that I hadn't ever considered until recently. Now, I've been preaching full-time for over 20 years. I have preached lessons on Naaman many times. But I must confess, The point I'm about to make never crossed my mind until last week. There is a very, very, very important lesson about speaking life. Speaking life. Proverbs 18:21 says, "The tongue has the power of life and death." That means our words are powerful. And our words can be used for good or for evil. They can build up or tear down. They can bring life or they can produce death. And 2 times in this story, we see people who chose to speak life. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean they were given an opportunity to speak good, to speak hope, to speak life into somebody. Let me show you what I mean. Miss Naaman's maid, that little girl that was carried off from her home. Verse 3 says, she went to Miss Naaman and said, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." Here's this little girl. Most believe she was probably around 12 to 13 years old. She had been abducted from home. She's forced into slavery. As I said earlier, it would be so easy to find joy in Naaman's condition. It would be so easy to harbor a lot of animosity and resentment. But she chose to speak life that day. She went to Mrs. Naaman and said, "Look, I know you're upset about Naaman's condition. I know it seems hopeless. But I want to tell you about a guy I know back home. I want to tell you about this prophet. If Naaman can go and see him, I'm confident he'll be healed." That says a lot about her faith in God, doesn't it? But do you see my point? She spoke life into Naaman that day. And then we see it again with Naaman's servants in verse 13. He's on his way home in a huff. He's angry, fit to be tied. It would have been very easy for them to remain silent, but instead they chose to speak life that day. They approached Naaman and said, "Look, it's a great word the prophet has spoken to you. He's actually said that you can be healed, you can be cleansed." Do you see my point? These people, just average, ordinary, everyday people, had a chance to speak life, to bring hope and encouragement to someone else, to give good advice, and they chose to do it. And I just wonder, how many chances do we miss on a daily basis to do the same? How many times in our everyday activities do we encounter people who could use some life spoken into them, but we choose not to? Let me give you some examples. A teammate missed the game-winning free throw. Now, you could speak death to that teammate. You could say, "You know what, if you'd have worked harder in the off season, or if you'd have stayed after practice and shot free throws with some of the other guys, or I knew you'd blow it." Right? That's speaking death to that teammate. Or you could speak life. You could say something like, "You know, if I'd made that easy layup in the first quarter, we wouldn't have even needed the free throw. This loss is really on me. I have no doubt you'll drain it next time." That's speaking life into your teammate. Or a coworker is contemplating divorce. You could speak death to that divorce, to their relationship, or to their marriage, I should say, to that relationship. When you hear that he's flirting with divorce, thinking about divorcing, you could say, "Oh, bachelorhood, welcome back. Getting rid of the old ball and chain, I don't blame you." That's speaking death to their relationship. Or you can choose to speak life. You could say something like, "Man, you and your wife make such a great couple. She's blessed you with 2 adorable kids, a nice home. She's fun to be around. I really wish you'd reconsider. In fact, my wife and I would love to go out with you 2 on a double date." That's speaking life into their relationship. A fellow member is getting lax in their attendance. You could speak death to them. You could say, you know what? I knew you weren't going to be fully committed. I knew you were going to be a lukewarm Christian. You'd rather be doing something else on Wednesday night than here in Bible study. Shame on you. You could say that. But you're speaking death when you put it like that. Or you could speak life. You could say something like this. Have I told you how thankful I am to have you as my brother in Christ? You're such an invaluable part of this church. And one of the things I look forward to on Sundays and Wednesdays is seeing you. You've changed their whole attitude, haven't you? You've spoken life into them. A friend has seemed really down for some time, and you've noticed that. Speak life. Do you want to talk? I'd really like to get some coffee and hear what's on your mind. A classmate struggling to fit in. Great opportunity to speak life into that person. Hey, would you like to sit with me at lunch today? Do you see my point? The wise man Solomon said, life and death are in the power of the tongue. I don't even feel responsible enough to have that kind of power, but we all do. And brethren, what we say in various situations can make or break a person. It can literally bring life or death. So in closing, I just want to challenge all of us, starting right here with me, to recognize that our words are powerful tools. They carry more weight than we realize and can greatly impact the lives of others for good or for bad. My encouragement is, let's start making it our goal to speak life into other people. You may not encounter a Naaman who's literally dying of a disease, but you'll encounter Naamans all the time. They're hurting. They feel hopeless. Their life is full of despair. They could desperately use a pick-me-up. Let's be that person. And when we are that person, guess what? Christ will be glorified, and more souls will be saved. If you're here this morning and not a child of God, we never wrap up without giving you that opportunity to put on Christ in baptism. You want to do it? You got pretty much two options. You could be Naaman before dipping, when he was arrogant, where he thought his think-sos were best. Or you can be the Naaman that humbles himself, trusts what the prophet says, goes down into the water, comes up, and then goes away praising God forevermore. That's what I'd suggest. The water's ready, it's warm. We got really cool t-shirts you can wear, take home. We'll all huddle around the baptistry to cheer you on, seeing you added to God's family. How cool is that? Being added to God's family and having the leprosy of your soul cleansed. Sounds like a great deal to me. You don't need to bring a pile of money. You don't need to bring expensive clothing. It's a free gift. It's by grace. If you want to take advantage of that, there's no better time than this time. Follow the good example of Naaman. Dip, contact the blood of Christ, and be saved, as together we stand and sing.